Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to be looking at the war with Mexico, what we've been kind of hinting at and building to really throughout this chapter. We've already looked at some of the background to this, including the whole concept of manifest destiny, the whole Texas situation. We're going to look at that a little bit more specifically here in just a second. And this is sort of when we think of, well, at least when I think about manifest destiny in this part of the 19th century, prior to the Civil War, this is kind of like the big moment. This is sort of the probably the most aggressive and conflict based situation where territorial acquisition happens, and manifest destiny is such a huge part of it. But with this, seeing as how manifest destiny was that belief that the United States needed to expand and needed to expand all the way to the Pacific Ocean, the Mexican War is certainly an important moment in that, because this is when the United States will gain a significant amount of territory, leading to territorial acquisition all the way to the Pacific Ocean. So we're going to be first kind of putting everything we've looked at the past couple of sections sort of into context, because all of these things regarding Oregon and Texas and all of this were kind of happening at about the same time. And I mentioned the other day that when Texas is annexed, part of the reason for that, despite issues over slavery, despite concerns about upsetting Mexico, that there was just a greater urgency to annex Texas because manifest destiny was at such fever pitch. In fact, you had a presidential administration in power, in charge at the time, in which manifest destiny was absolutely 100% a part of the national agenda. So we want to look at that. So background to a lot of this and what helps us understand the context of Texas and all of this is, again, manifest destiny becoming a serious political issue. It was a big issue in the election of 1844. The winner of that election was James K. Polk. So James K. Polk becomes president as a result of the election of 1844. And James K. Polk was a huge manifest destiny advocate. Think of President Polk as your manifest destiny president. This was 100% his goal, and he made this his mission. He made this his campaign promise, was to fulfill manifest destiny. Specifically, he promised in his campaign that he would acquire Texas, because the Texas situation, that whole annexation, had been hanging in the balance for about 8 or 9 years at this point. So he promised to annex Texas no matter what it took, also promising Oregon, a settlement to the Oregon question. This is in the context of the dispute with Britain over the Oregon Territory. So this is prior to that compromise being reached. This is when they are arguing over it. And James K. Polk would have been a 54-40 or fight kind of a person. In fact, 54-40 or fight was part of his campaign slogan. I mentioned that was a big slogan for those particular advocates. And the election of 1844 is essentially when that was taking place. And he also promises California. So Texas, Oregon, and California are his three big things. Overall, manifest destiny. And he promises to get all of those things, and even promises to do it in one term. He says that he can do it all in one term. So that is the big issue. Now, we know that the Oregon thing is eventually worked out with the compromise line at the 49th parallel, and Texas is annexed by joint resolution as opposed to a full treaty. So there you have it, two of those three goals already right there. So the next thing is California, and that plus lingering issues with Texas are eventually going to lead us to the Mexican War. So let's look at some of these specific background causes to the war with Mexico. One of those, of course, has to do with Texas. We know that Mexico was very angry with the United States over the annexation of Texas, saw this as aggression, saw this as illegal. And part of the reason for that was because they argued that at least part of Texas still belonged to them and was still part of Mexico. So if we get a little bit more specific with it, what we see is that there was a boundary dispute over Texas, in that the United States and Mexico were both claiming different places to be the boundary of Texas. And so there was a significant amount of disputed territory that both the United States and Mexico were claiming. And you can see that on the map. The Rio Grande, that is the boundary that the United States claims. So the United States claims that the boundary is the Rio Grande. And as you noticed, and you probably are aware, this is, of course, the modern day boundary between Texas, or the United States, and Mexico. However, the Mexican government claims that it is the Nueces River, right here. So they say that it's the Nueces River, about 150 or so miles north, creating this rather large amount of disputed territory. So you can probably guess that's going to be a hot spot for potential violence, potential fighting to break out, because both the United States and Mexico are claiming that land to belong to them. And so when the United States annexes Texas, that's part of the reason why they got so angry, because they said it's illegal. You can't annex part that really belongs. Or just mentioned a moment ago that one of the other big things that Polk had on his agenda was California. California by that point was interesting to Americans for not only farming but also ranching, and there had been a relatively significant amount of settlement out to California, same as had been for Oregon and all of that. So this is part of his agenda as well. California, keep in mind, was part of Mexico, the same as Texas had been, and all of those things that you just saw, that whole southwestern chunk was all still part of Mexico. And so to try to get this diplomatically, to try to use diplomatic channels to acquire California, Polk sends an ambassador, John Slidell, who happened to, or he did speak Spanish, so he was seen as an appropriate choice. And so he was sent to Mexico to negotiate with the Mexican government about the possibility of buying California. But the Mexican government wouldn't even meet with him. They were so angry over even the notion of the United States buying California. All of this just reinforced their fears and their beliefs that the United States was aggressive and trying to take their territory and all of those kinds of things, that they wouldn't even meet with him. So that outrages President Polk and some of your other Manifest Destiny advocates, seen as very, very disrespectful, a slap in the face, that they would not even receive John Slidell as a representative, much less hear what he had to say about the purchase of California. That also means for President Polk that it's clear that California is not going to be acquired by means of diplomacy. And therefore, if they're going to acquire it, it's probably going to take a little bit more aggression. Now, before we get into the war itself, so anyway, backing up for just a moment, there are your really three major background causes. It's this desire for California and the inability to get it through diplomatic channels, a boundary dispute over Texas, and then just overall anger and resentment over the United States' annexation of Texas. Now, this war that we're about to support it, the big arguments there is that it just simply was not justified, that this was all sort of a trumped up reasons, that it just was not reason enough to go to war, that this was all just kind of a scheme to add territory, which maybe it kind of was. But a lot of people did not support that said antagonizing another country, going to war, all of those things are not justified for expanding territory. And furthermore, it wasn't just the expanding territory, it's the whole questions that come with that. There was a strong belief amongst a lot of people that were opposed to this war that this was a way to expand slavery, or this was going to mean the expansion of slavery, or that this was some kind of a plot to expand slavery. So there were significant voices of opposition that said this simply isn't justified. And some of that's going to make more sense in just a moment when we look at the actual outbreak of the war and what led to the fighting. You're going to see in just a minute while some people would say this wasn't justified and that this was, some of these reasons were exaggerated, if not falsified by President Polk and some of those that were kind of looking for an excuse, that this was all kind of an excuse to get territory, an excuse to spread slavery, and all these other things were just sort of exaggerated around it. So again, that's going to make more sense here in just a moment. So let's see that. So the actual outbreak of the war itself is what we're going to look at next. So we have our background causes of, the whole Manifest Destiny thing, the desire for territory, the boundary dispute over Texas, concerns over Texas annexation in general, and then the whole California thing. So the outbreak of the war, no surprise, is going to happen in that disputed territory, that area that we just saw on the map that both the United States and Mexico are claiming to belong to them. Because it was disputed, to avoid conflict, both sides were avoiding militarizing that whole disputed area. In other words, they were avoiding sending any troops, any military presence into that area to avoid any kind of confrontation. But that's what the United States will eventually change. So General Zachary Taylor, American Army general, had troops in Texas, not in the disputed part just yet, but he was commanding troops close to the disputed territory. President Polk ordered him to take his troops and cross over the Nueces River into that disputed territory. Now, from President Polk's point of view, he can argue, I'm just telling you to go into that territory, which is in fact ours, because remember, all of that land that we're talking about, the land that Taylor's being sent into, the United States claims to belong to them. So when they cross into that disputed territory, though, as you can imagine, Mexico saw that as a hostile act, leading to a conflict, leading to the outbreak of a fight, a smallish fight between Mexican forces and Taylor's forces right there along the Nueces River. So American forces cross into the disputed territory and a fight breaks out. And Taylor will then use this as justification to ask for war. So he will go to Congress and ask for a declaration of war. And these words right here, that way, these words right here are one of the things that he says when he comes to Congress. He says that American blood has been spilt on American soil, basically arguing they attacked us on our own land. This is cause for war. But you could see that the Mexican government would say, no, you crossed over into our land and we're just defending ourselves. This is why one of the reasons why this would be such a controversial fight, and why some people would argue that this whole thing was exaggerated or even provoked, and say that this was kind of what Polk wanted and that he sent Taylor there knowing that they would likely get attacked, or maybe even hoping that they would get attacked. And it would give him an excuse, a reasoning to go to Congress and ask for a declaration of war. Furthermore, some of the details surrounding this were really quite sketchy. There were inconsistent reports or missing information about exactly what happened, about exactly where it happened and when it happened. All of that was kind of sketchy. So while obviously Congress will support overall a declaration of war, there were some individuals that had some questions and said, this isn't enough. We don't have enough information to really prove that this was hostile, to really prove that what you're saying actually happened, or that it was actually an attack by Mexico, that it wasn't somehow provoked, all those kind of things. So once again, not only can this war be controversial because of the whole slavery issue and expanding territory, but the whole justification thing, a lot of that comes in from the way that it started and the questions over if it was truly warranted or if it was not, if it was actually provoked. And then you had some that said, who cares if we provoked it? This is manifest destiny. It's what we got to do. So we're not going to look so much at particular battles and strategies itself. I'm going to show you those things on the map really quick. Relatively speaking, wars are terrible. However, the Mexican War goes tremendously well for the United States. And is relatively quick. And the United States chose their enemy well. The Mexican government and army were not incredibly powerful. Never mind. Announcements keep interrupting me, but I took my phone off the hook and I forgot that. So there were kind of three parts to the American strategy. First, we see General Taylor's forces that were here around in the disputed area. They are going to continue to invade through northern Mexico. You can see on this map some of the battles, and you see a number of American victories there in that first phase of the war. You also have an American General Kearny, and it looks like Kearney on here, but it's actually pronounced Kearney, who is going to go west to capture California. So Polk uses this as an opportunity to capture California now that we are at war with Mexico. And that went very well as also. California was not very well defended at all. You actually had parts of California where there was a significant amount of American settlement there. And so some of those American settlers in California actually staged their own revolt against the Mexican government before American forces even arrived. That's what this Bear Flag Revolt thing was about. That was a rebellion, sort of like the Texas Revolution, but California. And they even claimed to set up their own independent government there, the Bear Flag Republic. That never officially is recognized as an official country, but it makes the takeover of California pretty effortless for the United States once Kearny arrives. And then the third and final phase of the war is General Winfield Scott, who's going to take his forces from New Orleans, swing them around to the Gulf of Mexico, the very first amphibious landing of American forces, and eventually march his forces, meeting up with General Taylor's and attacking and capturing Mexico City right there, the capital of Mexico, by September of 1847. So with the capture of Mexico City, the Mexican capital, that ends the Mexican War in a significant American victory. So now we want to take a look at the end of the conflict, the peace treaty, and the agreements that are made at the end of the war. Which very much favor the United States. So this was a major victory for the United States, which led to a lot of excitement, pride, nationalism, all of those things. And the treaty that officially ends the war is the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So this ends the fighting with Mexico, ends the Mexican War, and with it, the United States is going to gain significant spoils of war, as it were, significant territory. Because of their very, very significant victory here. So, in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, one, Mexico will give up all claims to Texas. So, all of that dispute over whether or not Texas was really part of the United States, those kinds of things, they have to give up on that and pretty much acknowledge that Texas is part of the United States. The boundary of Texas is going to be set, of course, at the Rio Grande, where it remains to this day. And the United States is also going to get a significant amount of Mexican territory. This whole section that you're seeing right here on this map, all this red, California, you see Nevada there, all of Utah, parts of New Mexico, parts of Arizona, even parts of Colorado and Wyoming, all included in all of that. We call this the Mexican Cession. So the Mexican Cession is included in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, this whole basic southwestern chunk of what is today the United States. You can see that a couple of entire states eventually come out of that. Parts of a few other states come out of that. This amounted to about half of Mexico's territory that the United States is going to gain. So a significant amount of territory. And with this, the United States has almost all of the land that becomes the continental United States. Not every little bit, but almost all of it. This is the only piece that's left, and I'll talk about that here in just a second. The United States does pay Mexico some for this, but they're actually paying less for all of that than they were offering for just California alone a few years before. So there is some monetary compensation there, but it is pretty minuscule given the amount of territory that the United States was getting. So the United States receives the Mexican Cession as a result of the Mexican War. I do want to talk for just a second about this last little bit, this sort of tan that you see right here, this little bottom strip of what is today Arizona and New Mexico. That is called the Gadsden Purchase, and that was purchased from Mexico a few years later, 1853. The United States bought the Gadsden Purchase. And the reason for it was because it was flat. You have all the mountains, Rocky Mountains, that are kind of going through that area. And we'll talk more about this in a little bit, but this is in the moment where the, plans for railroads moving out west, particularly talk about a transcontinental railroad, a railroad to go all the way from east to west, is in the works. They haven't obviously started building it yet, and they won't for a while. It's just in the talking phases. But the reason behind the Gadsden Purchase was that because it was flat, it might be a better route or a possible route for a transcontinental railroad to go through. And with the Gadsden Purchase, the United States does possess all of what is today the continental United States. So everything that makes up the continental United States today is, not necessarily a state yet, but is at least owned and possessed by the United States after that last little bit is purchased with the Gadsden Purchase in 1853. So the Mexican War leaves a complicated legacy. Again, it was very, very controversial at the time because of concerns over slavery. And as we'll see in a little bit, none of that was unfounded, because it is going to ignite significant questions about slavery in the West. And we're going to see that question be unavoidable. This is why by the 1850s, the slavery question, will eventually sort of overtake everything else. The war itself, again, was relatively speaking, very successful. The deadliest thing in it was disease, which was common for wars in this particular day. The United States expands tremendously, expanding its territory by about a third. It's the first, kind of imperialistic, territorial grabbing kind of war, probably the most aggressive war by the United States up until that particular point. It's the first time the United States occupies an enemy capital. It is also, results in a lot of pride, a lot of excitement, but for some, it is seen as a shameful war of conquest and one that was done for the sake of expanding slavery and all of those things. It is also, in some ways, kind of a preview, a little tiny bit of the Civil War, which is going to break out about 15 years later. This is where a lot of your Civil War generals, Civil War leaders kind of cut their teeth and got their first military experience. They all were, fighting together here and will find themselves on opposite sides of a fight, just less than 2 decades later. So we'll start to look at these questions about slavery in this area and how to answer those questions and the disputes about that next time. So that's where we're heading. We are seeing that slavery question become absolutely unavoidable.